Right, my name is Steve Brodie. I'm the former BBC Home Affairs correspondent here in the West Country. I was in newspapers before that, and then I worked in commercial radio, and then joined the BBC in radio as a producer, and ended up as a correspondent.
Can you tell us something about the union and that's role in journalism?
Yes, the National Union of Journalists, obviously known as the NUJ, is a very old and well-established trade union. It had its heartlands in Fleet Street and went out into the regions. A very dignified trade union and not often seen in the headlines. Has a code of conduct about how to behave in a moral and proper manner, and is generally very well supported and well represented. Most journalists working in the regions, both in radio and television, are members of the NUJ. It's not a very big union, but it's very effective and has been a good watchdog over bad behaviour amongst journalists, especially in Fleet Street.
And also editors and managers.
Yes, indeed. When I was an editor in local radio, I was a member of the NUJ, and I've been a lifelong member of it. And you will frequently find people right up the management tiers being member of the NUJ.
What do the cuts or proposed cuts that the region here in Bristol mean for the people in Bristol in the West?
Well, the effects are going to be widespread and damaging. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. For instance, the current affairs programme Inside Out West, based in Bristol with 12 or 13 people working for it, at least 50% of those have been asked to take voluntary redundancy. And it means, at the moment, Tony, throughout England and Wales, there are 11 regional Inside Out programmes. They're going to be cut from 11 down to 6. For instance, here in the West, the programmes in Southampton and Plymouth are going to be axed. There'll be one programme, a half-an-hour programme on BBC One every week during the programme's run. That'll be based in Bristol, but there'll only be one story. At the moment, you have 4 or 5 stories per region, which, of course, is the whole idea of local journalism for local people, focusing on local problems.
So what is Inside Out West doing that the Points West and the News is not?
Well, Inside Out West, of course, is a half-an-hour programme. So therefore, you can do greater in-depth journalism. That's very important. Some complex things like corruption in banking, abuse, needs to have a proper amount of time to get to the bottom of it, to give both sides, to make sure that you're giving a balanced and in-depth report. You can't do that every night on Points West, who certainly do very good programmes, but Inside Out West does longer investigations throughout our area.
What about lunchtime and evening news programmes?
Well, I'm afraid these cuts outside Inside Out West, at Points West, will mean that both technical and journalistic staff are going to be made redundant. At the moment, there's an offer out to volunteer for voluntary redundancy. That has now closed. That closed last week. It means that there will be fewer journalists. For instance, it will also mean, instead of having 2 presenters at 18:30, familiar faces for many years in Bristol, like David Garmston and Alex Lovell, only one of those will survive. It means that there'll be a change of style, and it will actually mean less stories. There'll be less stories on the 18:30 programme. And that is very disappointing and is certainly not to the benefit of the people in Bristol.
What about Radio Bristol?
Well, Radio Bristol hasn't escaped either. One of the very oldest of local radio stations in the country. And it means their afternoon programme has gone. It's gone now. It went during the COVID pandemic, and they're not going to replace they're not going to bring it back. And it means that there will be only 3 programmes instead of 4 throughout the day. That itself is a very great shame. It cuts the voice of local people, which is what the BBC is about. It's about representing the public. And the public pay a licence fee, and they have the right for proper coverage. And these cuts certainly won't mean that.
I mean, hasn't the writing been on the wall for this for quite a long time? Inside Out West is only an occasional programme. It's been being eroded, hasn't it, for quite a long time, probably even decades. That sort of journalism from a regional perspective.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about that. We are peculiarly celebrating 50 years of BBC regional current affairs and local radio stations this year. Radio Bristol is 50 years old, for instance, this year. There was going to be a big party, and that's been abolished, sadly, because I'm sure there have been some very familiar faces that could have come back for that. The BBC has been under threat since David Cameron forced on the BBC a freeze of the licence fee. As we all know, a freeze is in fact a cut with inflation. And when David Cameron used his position to freeze the licence fee, which the BBC couldn't do anything about. I mean, the government is there to govern. And the BBC is independent of the government. People forget that. People think that the BBC should be there to produce government statements. Well, I've had 30-odd years in the BBC, and no member of the government has ever told me what to say. And that would be across the rest of the BBC. There is the argument, of course, that journalists in London get too close to members of Parliament or whatever. Well, they may do, but they still have the independence and the right to criticise. And that's absolutely fundamental, Tony, in a liberal democracy. You know, we're not living in a one-party state, although sometimes I feel possibly we are.
What about the NUJ? What's been their response? Can a union really do anything? Because the BBC have decided they're going to make these cuts. Well,
the NUJ can do quite a lot. There has been a union meeting called a chapel meeting, which is an old printing term, in the BBC in recent weeks. A very well attended virtual meeting, of course, and a resolution was passed which calls on the BBC to stop this, absolutely to stop this. For instance, there will be fewer technical staff, fewer cameramen, fewer people working in the gallery where the programme is produced. There's absolutely no doubt that standards will go down. And there has been a very strong resolution. And to get this right, in case make sure that anybody thinks that I'm making it all up, there was a resolution passed in which it says that the NUJ understands the BBC has financial restraints. We don't live in laissez-faire. None of us do. There are people here who are listening and watching to this interview who are either on furlough or either have already been made redundant and will not get their jobs back because of the pandemic. We mustn't forget that. But what's happened to the BBC is that we've asked the BBC, it's urged the Director General, the outgoing Director General, Tony Hall, that the ratio of managers to staff is at the moment quite ludicrous. And we have asked, the NUJ has asked, I have to say here, I'm just speaking on behalf of the NUJ, it's not me, it's the National Union of Journalists that are making these requests, to prioritise programme makers, prioritise people who go out and report on the community. That's very important. And to maintain the trust in the BBC of the public. If the BBC doesn't deliver, it will lose trust. There's no doubt about that. And we're saying that these cuts will affect the BBC's position in the country. It's a vital position, it must be maintained. And at that union meeting, it was revealed of the 6,000 staff in the English regions, English and Wales regions, there are 6,000 staff. Of those, there are 17 senior managers who are paid between £150,000 and £327,000. And those salaries are equal to or greater than that of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And on top of these, there are a further 29 senior managers who could be earning anything from somewhere between £100,000 and £150,000 a year. Well, if you're spending that sort of money on these myriad layers of management, the NUJ's position is that is ridiculous and wrong, and that the money should be spent on reporting what is going on in our society.
What about members of Parliament? Is Parliament taking an interest?
Yes, they have. Both Labour and indeed Conservative MPs have written to Parliament complaining about this. After all, if you're the local MP and there's no local radio station, no BBC local station with the resources to allow you to come on and talk, you have no voice yourself. So MPs are concerned that they will lose their voice. And that's vitally important, that local people can talk through their local MPs. That is the point of having MPs. And it's interesting that broadcasters like Lenny Henry and Stephen Fry and a collection of well-known celebrities have written to the national newspapers and indeed to the BBC saying, stop this. This is a wrong decision which will have a damaging effect on how we talk to one another and how we talk to the government and people who represent us.
But they are persisting. So at the moment, anyway, that's what we know. I mean, it does seem as if there's a bit of conflict between central government and the BBC itself. Is that the case?
Yes, this is dangerous waters, of course. All governments throughout the history of the BBC since the 1920s, all governments, when they are in power, always feel that the BBC's got it wrong and don't like it. And in a way, I think that's actually right. The BBC should not be popular with governments of whatever colour, and that has certainly been the case here. Although one has to say, looking at the culture and indeed the fact that recent statements by people in power, like Dominic Cummings, who has made it, he certainly hasn't hidden his desire to destroy the BBC behind anything. He's come out and said, you know, we don't like the BBC. We'd rather there wasn't a BBC. And of course, historically, people like the Murdoch Press and indeed associated newspapers, publishers of the Daily Mail, have always attacked the BBC. They've attacked them for the very good reasons that they are competitors, and the BBC mostly has employed the best journalists in the country. And it is in their interests to see the BBC minimalised, perhaps, or destroyed altogether.
Well, they will say, won't they, that the commercial broadcasters like Sky can do it just as well.
Really? Is that true? Give me one story that Sky has broken in the last decade of some magnitude. You can't, because they haven't. What Sky does is very professional, absolutely, there's no question of that whatsoever. How many stories a day do they do? Tell me.
They will get their stories as you do from the newspapers.
I don't think so. I don't think I've ever got a story from a newspaper, actually, Tony. I do my own research, and my colleagues do, and especially at BBC Points West, where people do research themselves. People like Matthew Hill, the health correspondent, Charlotte Callum, the Home Affairs correspondent, people like Clinton Rogers in Somerset. The very idea that he got a story, come on, that's why we're at the BBC. We go and find stories. Dave Harvey, the business correspondent, doesn't get it out of the local newspaper, goes and finds it himself. And if he doesn't, he jolly well should.
So what does this mean for journalism in the city? The BBC is actually breaking stories, whereas some other outlets may be just going on press releases, this sort of thing. Can you just talk a little bit about how you originate a story, or whether you just use
absolutely. Well, correspondents, people like me when I was working there, are paid to find their own stories. That's your role. You can't just come in and say, oh, it's in the Evening Post, let's do the story. I'm not saying that reporters don't do that, but correspondents are paid to go and find their own stories, and so they should. And that is why the BBC is very successful. But looking at it globally, as it were, certainly locally, look what's happened at the Evening Post. There have been redundancies at the Evening Post. I remember coming to Bristol 30-odd years ago. The Evening Post had 50, 60 pages. It probably had 50 journalists. There are now 2 correspondents on the Evening Post, one of whom is actually paid by the BBC, because the BBC pays for local government reporters. And that's one of their 2 correspondents, and that is provided by the BBC. And that is a pretty astonishing thing, that the BBC, in its time of travail, is still supporting local journalists. It's still providing a job for somebody to work at the Evening Post, which I think is a very good thing.
So what are the BBC themselves saying about all this? How have they reacted to your campaign?
Well, I obviously cannot speak for the BBC. That would be entirely wrong. You must ask them yourself, Tony, what they think. But I do remember a senior manager, and I've got to get this right, obviously, because senior managers don't like to be misquoted, but a senior management said that the BBC's local and regional services were created 50 years ago, as I mentioned. It's the birthday, the anniversary of Radio Bristol. And she said, despite their extraordinary skills, they need significant reinvention. How do you reinvent the wheel? What's wrong with them? Why doesn't she like them as they are? Kate Adie started on BBC Radio Bristol. Didn't do too badly. Why do we need any reinvention? So, I have no idea.
So, just to sum up, if these cuts do go through, what will it mean for viewers and listeners?
Well, Inside Out, obviously, will be unrecognisable, which is a great shame. That will be totally unrecognisable. 1 story a week from the whole of the Southwest. Somebody living on the tip of Cornwall is not going to be interested in what's happening in Eastern and vice versa, unless it's a world-shaking story. And despite our best efforts as journalists, we don't come up with world-shaking stories every day, much as we would like to, but we don't. So therefore, people in these areas will lose their voice. They won't actually see stories about Eastern, about what's happening in Bristol Crown Court, what's happening with Avon and Somerset Police. We won't, because it won't get on. And I forgot to tell you that the new Inside Out will be edited in Birmingham. Well, please, that is not local. That is not what the BBC is about.
How about radio?
Well, there is this argument that lots of people now get their news by looking at their iPhone. And that is an argument that the world has changed. And there's no doubt about it. There's nothing wrong with digital journalism at all. In fact, as part of these restructuring in Bristol, there will be more digital journalists. Those that you will see more digital work. There's nothing in itself wrong with that. There's some great digital work done on the BBC Online service. And if that goes, then you will struggle. You really will struggle. National newspapers are getting smaller. Most of them are now tabloids. The Guardian, the Evening Standard in London is making 150 journalists redundant, owned by a Russian oligarch, friend of Boris Johnson. The Guardian, at the other end of the scale, as it were, the other end of the political scale perhaps, is set to make journalists redundant. It's not just the BBC. And if we're not careful, we will not have an independent and powerful organisation to take on the big players, the big corporations, people like Donald Trump. You need proper journalists to take them on. If you don't have them, we're going to be in a very sad place. And a final point, Tony, and this is probably not known by many people, but programmes like Points West, like BBC Points West, put on audience. They put on extra people watching after the BBC flagships like the 6 o'clock news and the 10 o'clock news. The bulletins after them, the audience goes up. Little known fact, And the BBC should put its hands up and say, that's what we do. But of course, the BBC doesn't do that. It's one of those wonderful organisations that doesn't boast about itself. And it needs some champions, and I'm certainly one of them.
Steve Brodie.